All right, Stephanie, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, I can. We're good.
Great. Okay, so we're ready to go. Greetings, everybody. My name is Ed Estes. I teach real estate at Mount SAC. Some of you have seen me in our live classes down at the Arcadia Association. This thing is changing. Some of the forms I have uploaded are relatively new, and I anticipate in the next 2 to 3 weeks they're going to change again. So my recommendation is, as you're using these forms, if you want to save them as a template, my understanding is that zip forms, the forms in a template, a saved template, will update. But I know a lot of us save them as transactions. If you save a document as a transaction, it will not update. So to be on the safe side, it's always a good idea to change your forms or add new forms every time you're going to go out. So please go into the CAR forms library, upload the latest editions of forms. Don't print out a bunch of copies because the way CAR is moving on this, they can change those every 2 weeks. Sometimes they do, and CAR does not tell us that there are updates. So just FYI on that. So let's go ahead and into the materials. I think most of us understand all of these things, but there is some misconceptions out there. You hear that on the news. Proper use of coverings, gloves and masks. Gloves are designed to keep your hands clean if you are going into a potentially infectious environment. So the recommendation of the gloves are, when you get to a property, before you go in or before you access the lockbox, go ahead and put the gloves on, access your lockbox, go through the property, exit the property, return the key to the lockbox, then remove your gloves and throw them away in a safe condition in some sort of trash receptacle in your trunk. And then when you get home or get back to the office, empty the trash out of your trunk. The same thing would go with clients that are using gloves. For recommendation of gloves, I know the medical grade of gloves can be a little difficult to find right now because of demand. Also, they're a little pricey. I like the culinary gloves. Those are the gloves you often see that caterers will wear. They're not nearly as well, of the same quality, but they are sufficient for showing of properties, and they're less expensive. The purpose of masks is to keep you from infecting others. It will not protect you from other people, because if the virus is airborne, you can actually absorb it through your eyes. So again, keeping in mind that we wear masks to protect others from us. And as Governor Cuomo once said, a mask needs to cover your mouth and your nose. If it's not, then it's not a mask, it's a chin strap. So again, we want to use proper use of coverings. And one of the other reasons of use coverings is because it makes other people feel safe around us. If you're not near soap and water, you want to use hand sanitizers to make sure your hands are clean, particularly after you exit a property. But the best way is soap and warm water. And again, very important to extend courtesy to others. As I mentioned before, the reason we wear masks is to give courtesy to others. We're not going to infect them. Again, even though you don't feel like you're infectious, you could be asymptomatic. You could be carrying the virus but not even know it. Also, when showing properties, if you're a buyer's agent, we'll talk about this as we go through the forms, always a best practice to have your buyer pre-qualified or pre-approved, and be sure to show the buyer the property virtually before you take them out to the property. That way we know that they are a serious buyer. They have the ability to purchase this particular property, and we have less likelihood of just simply looky-loos going into properties. Always call ahead for seller's permission before you show the property. Again, use of mask and gloves. Be sure to access the lockbox when you're protected. Return the key to the lockbox. And then as you're going through the property, Avoid touching surfaces during showings. Also, best practice, only show the property to 2 people at a time or 1 person at a time. Never a good idea to have children going through the property because they touch everything. Again, try to limit your showings to those people that absolutely have to see the property. Let me go up here and see if we do have any chats, and I don't see any, so I think we're good there. Let me go back to my PowerPoint if I can, and let's go to the first form. All right, so there are actually 2 PEAD forms. The first form I have for you here, this is for the seller or an occupant. So whoever is in the property. We do have a PEAD for landlord-tenant situations, but you could also use this for tenants, but typically it is for the seller. So what is the purpose of this form? Essentially, this form advises the seller of the risks of having people come into their house during a COVID environment. So there is a risk of exposure. Okay, so we're making them aware of that, letting them know that real estate activities are an essential activity, although some counties may be more restrictive with the showings and the representation of buyer and sellers. Okay? The sellers acknowledging that they are now voluntarily allowing someone to come into their property, and that the seller, to the best of the seller's knowledge, is not infected, does not have any symptoms, and understands that they could be infected but not display any symptoms. And they are accepting the risk of having their property on the market. So just as before you would go skydiving or bungee cord jumping or any other activities that you really shouldn't be doing, the vendor will always have you sign a release form. Well, this essentially is that release form. We're letting the seller know of the risks, and they are accepting the risk. So this is known as the PEAD form. Now, if I can go to our next form, and then we'll open it up for questions on PEADs. We have the PEAD-V. This is for buyers and other visitors. And I say other visitors because you may want to use this PEAD-V form with appraisers, with home inspectors, termite inspectors. Again, anybody entering the property, it is a good idea to have them sign this form, okay? So these forms were constructed by CAR in light of the governor's executive order on how we're supposed to behave during COVID. So let me go into this form a little closer. Just like the PEAD seller occupancy form, the PEAD visitor or V form advises the buyer that there is a risk of exposure, that real estate activities are an essential service, okay, but they can be restricted based on what's going on with the COVID infection, that we are advising them to comply with all COVID directives, okay? The purpose of going into the property is to view the property, okay? To allow them to see what the property is like, right? And then we have number 4, our property entrant rules, okay? So they are to exercise care as they're going into the property, okay? They are to wear a face covering. They are to wash their hands before and after, or sanitize their hands before or after they enter the property. In the property, they are to avoid touching things as much as they can. Obviously, if you have a stairwell and a banister, they may have to touch that for physical guidance. But other than that, they're not supposed to touch anything. They are agreeing that they're not going to handle any brochures. There's not going to be any marketing materials in the property, okay? They are going to have read the posted rules for entry. We'll get to that form in a little bit. That's the PRE form. The seller has been advised that, or excuse me, the signer has been advised that the seller has been advised to keep the property sanitary. Okay? Again, you're representing as the buyer or the visitor that you don't have any symptoms. You have not been around anybody with symptoms. To the best of your knowledge, you don't have any symptoms. Of course, this has a 2-page, and then on the last page, some special advice that if you have minors, these regulations affect minors as well, but it's always good to have a conversation with our visitor, particularly potential buyers, that it's not a good idea to bring their children into the home during the COVID environment. All right. Now, that is essentially what we've got for the PEAD. We also have a PEAD for landlord-tenant situations. It will be noticed as the PEAD-LR. It is also a 2-page form. Now, before we get to our next form, the posted rules of entry, I'd like to see if anybody has any questions regarding the PEAD. And if I can go into the chat, doesn't look like there's anything. I think we're good. All right, so moving on. Oh, is that a question? Let me go up and see. I'm hearing little noises. That usually indicates questions. No, it must be somebody just joining us. All right. Let's see, should the selling agent sign each PEAD? Yes. Okay, if you've got a place for a signature, then it's a good idea for you to, whoops, went too small there. Sign the form. Going also back to the PEAD, you'll notice that the PEAD-S has a place for a property address. Of course, that's for the seller. So the seller, you would put the seller's address there. With the PEAD-V, you see you also have a place for an address. And the question often comes up, if the buyer is looking at more than one property, what address or addresses do we put down? And do we have to do a different PEAD for every property? Well, if you want to do a PEAD for every property, you can. However, one PEAD per buyer per day is viewed as sufficient. All right. So if I have 3 properties to show a buyer, I could certainly put the 3 property addresses in the PEAD, or I could just put see attachment and list the properties in an attachment that we're showing that day, or I could just put the first property we're showing that day. The reason we use a different PEAD every day is we'll call at the bottom of it, the signer's
join the meeting.
We are asking that the buyer or any other visitor verify that they do not feel infected or have not been near an infectious situation. That could change from day to day. So while I may not feel infectious today and nobody in my house feels infectious, tomorrow I could discover that somebody I was with yesterday or then has been declared or tested positive. So my response on this form would be different. So the recommendation is use a new PEAD-V for every day you're with the buyer. If you want to use the single or one PEAD for all properties that you show the buyer on a given day, you should be okay there. Some agents may make a more conservative approach and they may do a different PEAD for every property they show to the buyer. That is not necessary. All right. So let me go and see if we've got anything in the chat. Looks like we've got some chat questions here. My tenant, okay, so let me go to the beginning. Let's see. Should the selling agent sign EPED? That's no problem there. My tenant is there already, and I needs him to sign. Okay, you should have the tenant sign the PEAD when you take the listing. So when you take the listing from the landlord, that is when you want to give a PEAD to your tenant and have them sign. It is also a good idea to have them sign it again before you show it, but definitely when you take the listing. If the seller is still let's see, if seller is still owner occupied, can kids stay inside during the showing? It is recommended that all occupants of the property exit the property during the showing, including children. We will see in a little bit, the seller is responsible for cleaning or sanitizing the house before it is shown. So my recommendation is when the seller gets the call that the property is to be shown, have the seller send the kids outside, sanitize the property, and then allow the showing, keeping the children outside. If you've got buyer with children, the recommendation is have the children stay outside. Now that may mean that one parent will have to be with the children outside as one parent views the property, and then you switch out parents and show the other parent the property. Logistically, I'm not sure how you're going to do that, but that would be my recommendation. But again, never a good idea for children, particularly small children, because they're going to touch everything. And it kind of defeats the whole idea of the governor's mandate. You mentioned per buyer per day. Does that mean that each buyer has to sign a separate PEAD? I think if you've got a couple and they want to jointly sign one PEAD for today, that's fine. They're both acknowledging that they've reviewed the material and they are not infectious and they're accepting the risk. So I see no problems with a couple signing the same PEAD. Tomorrow, if I show that same couple more properties, I would then have them sign a new PEAD, specifically because we do want to verify that they do not feel infectious. They have not been in a situation that is compromised. All right. So again, that's why the new PEAD every time. Let's see. If tenant is the buyer, do we still need the PEAD form? If the tenant is the buyer, then I don't see you showing the property. Okay, so I don't think the PEAD would come into play because they're already in the property. And let's see, take a listing. I mean, nobody's entering the property. Once you go into escrow, you may want to have that tenant sign a PEAD if they're going to have a termite inspection, an appraisal, and or a physical inspection, because now you're inviting guests into that property. I would then go ahead and do a PEAD-LR for that tenant, okay? If that makes sense to you. But prior to going into escrow, since arguably nobody's going to be going into that property related to you, the agent listing or showing the property, then I don't see a need for a PEAD. Moving on down, let's see. Let's see, when you mentioned to sanitize the house, just the doorknob, light switches, and do forth at what level is required to be sanitized. There is no sanitized guidelines other than what we see from the CDC. Any surfaces that could be touched should be sanitized. So that would be railings, banisters, doorknobs, light switches, things of that nature. Here again, offering gloves to your clients kind of gives you a, another step up for additional protection. But again, that's the whole idea why we wear gloves, and after you exit the house, offering hand sanitizer to your clients who have just come into the property, because we don't know whether the seller actually did sanitize or not. Question, how would you handle parents who insist that their children enter the property with them? I would try to have a conversation with the parents prior to meeting them with showings, encourage them not to bring the children. If they insist on bringing their children in, if the seller is at the property, get confirmation from the seller that it is okay for the children to be in. Remind the parents that they have to keep the children under their supervision at all times. If you see children touching things, again, remind the buyer that they do need to do a better job of supervising their children. You really are in an awkward situation. I don't want you to alienate yourself from this potential buyer and potentially lose a sale. At the same time, we do need to, I don't want to use the word enforce, but recommend safe guidelines. All right. I think I've got, let's see, can you attach addendum to PEAD? So visitors signing, there are no changes from the PEAD when signed. Then you need a new one to repeat showing the same visitors. Here's the problem. The PEAD is only a couple of pages for visitors, right? So for the amount of work that you're going to go through to create an addendum, you could just give them a new PEAD. Secondly, if you're drafting addendums, you quite possibly are now entering into the unlicensed practice of law, because not only is a PEAD a statement that the visitor does not feel infected, but it is also an acknowledgement that they are assuming the risk of going into that property and being shown properties by you. You do not want to take the legal liability for that, so I would recommend that you not start drafting addendums. I wouldn't do it, and I've been an attorney for over 30 years. So go with the CVA-LR forms. They're going to give you that protection. Just have them sign a new PEAD if you're showing them properties at a later date, right? Okay, so it looks like I've exhausted the questions temporarily on the PEAD. So what I'm going to do now is go into the next form. If I can just figure out how to work my PowerPoint. So now we have the posted rules of entry. It is a 2-page document. Okay? You have the, shall we say, primarily textual page. We also have the pictograph page. We're supposed to use both. Now, what happens if you forget this PERE? Can you use the PEAD? Yes, you can actually take this form if you want to and post it on the door. The recommendation is use the later form, but if you don't have the later form and you've got a copy of the PEAD, you can put this on the door. But the recommendation is you use the posted rules of entry. And the posted rules of entry reminds people to wash your hands and use hand sanitizer, wear a face covering, socially distance, avoid touching surfaces, and finally, discard any disposable gloves properly. Now, the next question comes up, what about shoe coverings? If you want to use shoe coverings, if shoe coverings are provided, then go ahead and use shoe coverings. A lot of sellers may have shoe coverings for you. My concern of shoe coverings are you're going to be trying to fit these things on your shoes, which are dirty. And to me, it seems like you're just going to reinfect everything all again. So I'm not a big fan of shoe coverings. I see people using shoe coverings when it's wet and muddy outside, and they get mud and wet all over the shoe coverings, and then the shoe coverings track it all through the house, right? We've all had those experiences. So not a big fan of shoe coverings. I'm a big fan of face coverings, hand coverings, washing your hands, and disinfecting with hand sanitizers. So, you know, I would play the shoe covering situation by ear. If they're available, if the seller or the listing agent has asked that you use them, go ahead and use them. If you are the listing agent and you want to request that they be used, great. But I've not heard of any infections because of shoes. It's the touching of your face, your nose, your mouth. That's where the infection. Remember, you do not contract the illness or the virus by touching an infected area. You contract it by touching an infected area and then touching your mouth, your eyes, your nose. That's where it comes in. It needs to come in through a mucous membrane. Later, evidence has now been released that for the most part, it's not the touching, it's the sneezing, it's the yelling, it's the singing, it's the coughing. It becomes airborne. You do not have social distance, and that's how you contract it. You see, if you've got a face covering over your mouth and nose and you sneeze, it's not going to go anywhere. Or if it does, it's not going very far. All right. So again, that's the purpose of the face coverings. Now, this is the first page, which is basically our textual page. The second page is the pictorial for those people who don't read or can't read or are unable to read. All right. Letting people know this is your mask, this is your sanitizer, this is your 6 feet, throw your gloves away, this is your don't touch things, all right? And again, the incubation period is considered to be about 14 days. So again, if you come into contact with somebody or you suspect infection, the safety period is considered to be 14 days. After 14 days, if you don't show any signs, you're probably okay. Now, let me go on up and see if we've got anything in the chat. And it doesn't look like we do. Any questions on the PRE forms? I'm not seeing any. All right. So we will now move to the next form. This is what's called the RLA-CA. Now, we all, or most of us, remember that the RLA stands for the Exclusive Right to Sell Listing Agreement. So what this is an addendum or an amendment to the listing agreement. Now, when this form was introduced, we had a number of listing agreements out there. So it was then called an amendment. An amendment is something you attach to an already existing contract. An addendum is something you attach to a contract that's in the process of being agreed upon. So if you have a listing agreement out there and you don't have this document as part of that agreement, it will be an amendment. Just add it to it. You and the seller sign it. Okay, thank you very much for muting yourself. If you are obtaining a listing now, then you would use this as a part of that agreement. We call it an addendum, all right? So what does this do? Well, It's a little bit of a duplicate document to that PEADS for the seller, all right? But it goes into greater detail. The first paragraph talks about the effects of the worldwide coronavirus pandemic. And then we go into paragraph 1, dealing with property showings. Now, the boilerplate or the set language, okay, the default language, as I often like to call it, states that the seller is going to allow prospective purchasers to enter the property. If, however, you check that box on the first line of 1A, then the seller's not agreeing to have their property shown. So, not quite sure how you're going to sell that property now, but again, that's why it's not pre-checked. It states that the seller has been advised of the risks involved, and that's where that PEADS comes in. And you'll notice that it says that the broker has provided the seller with a PEADS. Also, you have shared with them the CAR Best Practices Guide, which continually changes. It goes from 8 pages to 2 pages to 5 pages. Last I checked, it was currently at 5 pages. But anyway, you've given that document to them, and we will go through that document shortly. That is the BPPP. Then we are asking the seller for direction on how to deal with prospective purchasers, okay? We are saying, or the seller and us are agreeing, because we're the listing agent, that all visitors will be given and sign the PEADV form, which we just showed. Now we have 1B2 and B3. 1B2 states that the showing agent, the buyer's agent, what we used to call the selling agent, will provide verification that the buyers can purchase the property, okay? So that would be a pre-qualification or a pre-approval letter typically. B3 states that they've already viewed the property online. So they've gone through some kind of a virtual tour, right? Now, this is where it gets a little awkward, and this is where we're going to have to work with each other. You are the listing agent. Presumably, your seller is going to want paragraph 1B, 2, and 3 checked. So then when you put that listing into the MLS, you will probably put in confidential remarks, please verify all buyers have been pre-qualified or pre-approved, or if you're going to use an all cash, verification of that prior to showing the property, because that's what the seller has asked for. So if you are representing a buyer, when you look at that listing, if that listing agent is asking you to send over verification of pre-qualification or pre-approval, you're supposed to do that. Likewise, they may ask you, has your buyer seen the property online? As part of your practice of representing buyers, you should be showing the property online to your buyers, so the buyers have a fairly definitive intent that this property is a candidate for them to purchase, all right? Yes, buyers are shown properties. Communication between the two agents is not always good. It is quite possible that a buyer would be shown a property and the buyer did not get pre-qualified and the buyer did not get to see the property online. Bad showing agent. You are not following the guidelines, okay? So again, we can get into a discussion with this if you want, but all I can do is saying or showing you what you should be doing, what the best practices are. Whether agents out there do it or not, let's face it, we know that agents out there don't do what they're supposed to be doing. All right? Okay, let me go into paragraph 2 now and paragraph 3. Paragraph 2 is marketing activities. Excuse me. These are designed as things you do before you get an accepted offer. Paragraph 3 are post-acceptance and other necessary sale activities. These are things you do once you're in escrow. Kind of, sort of. I know preparing an AVID, in other words, the agent's visual inspection, is shown up in number 2. Perhaps when CAR wrote this, they were envisioning that this would only pertain to the listing agent. And of course, best practices, listing agents should do their AVID when they take the listing. They should also have the seller complete a TDS and SPQ when they take the listing. All right. So that's why it's in the marketing activities. When we drop down into the post-acceptance, now we go into all the things we do in escrow. And of course, the agent representing the buyer is going to be doing their AVID during escrow, more than likely. All right. So again, don't get too hung up on whether it's a marketing activity or a post-acceptance activity. Just want to advise the seller what we're going to be doing in terms of the marketing of the property, because we're going to have activity on the property. People are going to be coming in the property. And once we're in escrow, we're going to have all kinds of people coming into the property, right? We're going to have the buyer coming in 2 or 3 times because they're going to be inspecting, they're going to be investigating, they're going to be measuring for furniture, all that stuff, right? I mean, there's just a lot of activity. And remember, most people buy or sell a home, what? 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. So they're not used to all the activity that happens. We are, we know about it. We want to share that with the seller, all right? And then the second page, again, seller prohibiting or limiting access to the property. That's going to make it difficult to market the property, all right? Going through paragraph 5, showing and access rules, okay? We're following COVID guidelines. And this is where, under showing requirements and rules, we are asking the seller to make sure that there is sanitizer or sanitizing wipes and face coverings at the property, okay? That is a seller's responsibility, right? It is also the seller's responsibility under 5C to clean and sanitize after each showing. So it often comes up, can we do open houses yet? And the answer is not really. First of all, some counties actually prohibit it, but under these guidelines, you're supposed to clean and sanitize after each showing. And of course, that's not possible when you have 3 or 4 sets of couples coming in and out of the property at the same time. You just can't do it. I guess you could do a sequential open house where you have a couple come in and leave, sanitize, next couple comes in and leaves, and sanitize. But again, it's not recommended. Okay, so logistically, we still cannot do open houses, all right? There is a provision under C2 where the agent can be authorized the seller to contract for a sanitizing company to come in. But again, it is the seller's responsibility. However, the listing agent is responsible to see that it's done. So as the listing agent, if you see a situation where the seller is not sanitizing or cleaning, if the seller is not maintaining those masks or those disinfectants, those wipes, things of that nature, You, the listing agent, are responsible of talking to the seller and make sure that it's complied with, okay? And again, I have some concerns about irresponsible sellers with irresponsible children using the wipes, the masks, and not leaving them to be available for visitors who come in. So, just FYI on that. Okay. We will also have possibility of a temporary withdrawal of the property from the market. So if at such time the seller says, look, I'm just not comfortable with people coming into my property anymore, it's not working out, and they want to withdraw it from the market, you withdraw it from the market. If you withdraw it from the market for, say, 2 months, then the language states that the listing period or the listing agreement will be extended for those 2 months to compensate for the time it was off the market. However, you can check the second box in paragraph 7, which means you will not extend the marketing time, which means you're just short, okay? Again, that's something that you would have to discuss with your seller should you find yourself in a situation where the seller does not want to have the property shown, all right? Let me minimize this a little bit and see what we have up in the chats. Okay. Can we give a good definition for the word sanitize? Seems to be a gray area what it means. Wiping down areas that are touched with a disinfectant would be my best recommendation, Sean. You're right. I mean, we follow CDC guidelines. It needs to be cleaned. So I would say, and this is what I would do, after I show the property, okay, I would get a disinfectant wipe that's hopefully provided by the seller. I would make a quick cleaning of all banisters, light switches, or maybe carry one with me as we go through the property. And after I turn off the light switch or leave a room, then just wipe anything down that I touched with that sanitizing wipe. The seller is supposed to have the property clean. So I guess periodically they need to do a thorough cleaning of that property, particularly after showings. But you're right, we don't really have a definition of sanitizing. It's kind of like hotels stating they're doing a deep cleaning. We don't have a definition of deep cleaning either. So that's about the best you're going to get from me. I do apologize for that. The next form, coronavirus addendum, known as the CVA. This is an attachment to the purchase agreement. And the purpose for this document is to advise and get direction from the parties as to what will happen or what they will do if more time is needed to close escrow or release a contingency. All right. So you'll see at the very top, it states that this is part of the purchase agreement. If you receive an offer on your listing and this is not included, then you would want to include this as an addendum to your counteroffer, assuming you're making a counteroffer. Right? So again, under paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, it's advising of the situation of COVID and that we are in an area of unforeseen circumstances. Now, there is a defense to breach of contract known as impossibility. There's also a French word for it called force majeure. So for some reason, attorneys like to use the word force majeure. The same thing as impossibility. In other words, something unforeseen has happened, causing the parties not to be able to perform within the time frame. Okay, so if you have a situation where the buyer needs more time to remove contingencies, they're having problems getting their loan or loan approval, there's an investigation issue or an appraisal issue because of COVID. Now that's the key thing. It has to be related to COVID. It can't be because, I don't know, their car broke down, or they got the flu. Not COVID, they got the flu, or they broke their leg. No. It has to be related to COVID. And the buyer needs more time to remove contingencies. A loan officer is out sick, or they've got sick children at home because of COVID. The inspector can't come out because their significant other just tested positive for COVID. Same thing with the appraisal or the appraiser. So they need more time. The buyer has already released their contingencies, or the buyer is on the 17th day of their contingency, but the buyer needs more time. If this box under 4A is checked, and this is part of the contract, it means that if there is a COVID issue, then we will give the buyer an extra 30 days to complete their contingencies. Likewise, under B, if the buyer or the seller need more time to close. In other words, the loan's not funding. The seller can't move to another house because the house they were going to move into, that seller can't move out because they tested positive. Or the seller is now self-quarantining because they've been around somebody who was infectious. So they have to self-quarantine for 14 days. Whatever. The bottom line is we cannot close the escrow. 4B states that the closing date can be extended for up to 30 days. Now, you can lengthen or shorten this 30-day period. They just put 30 days as the default language. You'll know that there's a blank after that. You can increase it or decrease it. I wouldn't recommend decreasing it less than 14 days because that is the incubation time that we talk about. So again, we want to keep it probably at least 14 days, but CAR, being cautious, put in the 30 days, all right? Or we're not going to extend the time. 5 is cancellation. In other words, the parties are saying if COVID should cause a delay, we're just going to cancel. So the parties are making a decision at the time of contract. If COVID creates a delay, either we're going to accommodate that delay up to 30 days, or we're going to cancel the agreement. In other words, there is no defense of impossibility. There's no defense of force majeure because the parties have already anticipated it. And it's addressed here in this addendum to the agreement for the sale of the property. All right? Now, real quick, let me go up and see if we've got any chats. It doesn't look like we do. Okay, so we can then move on. Assuming I can get my thing to work. There we go. We also have a CVA for leases. You may be entering into a lease with a prospective tenant, and for whatever reason, they cannot move in at the set time because the old tenant's not moving out, or for whatever reason, they can't move in. So again, if you're dealing with property management and you're doing leasing, we have an addendum for that as well. Now, in the CVA, okay, that COVID addendum, we stated that if the buyer needs more time for contingencies, or if either the buyer or the seller needs more time for closing related to COVID, okay, they can do that. However, they need to state why, and they need to prove it. So as I said before, it has to be COVID related. If it's unrelated to COVID, okay, let's say they're a tenured teacher. Well, teachers are still being paid in COVID. We're teaching online now, right? But they lose their job because they beat up a child and they got fired. Can they use that as an excuse? No, because it wasn't COVID related, okay? They were fired for a different reason. So if the reason the parties can't perform is related to COVID, they need to state then what that reason is. And that's what we see here under paragraphs 1, A, B, C, and D. So A is loan related, B is stay at home or government order related, C is personal impact, and D is other. You've got something that CAR didn't think of, right? Okay, so you need to let the other party know why. And then in number 2, you need to tell them what it is. You got to verify it. All right. So if it is loan related, and let's say it's a loss of income due to COVID, they should have something from their employer laying them off or reducing their hours. If we could just mute ourselves, because we got some people talking there with unmuted mics. Thank you. They need to then verify that, include a copy of that notice from the employer, all right? If the home inspector can't get out to the property to inspect because they're under a self-quarantine, then that email that you received from the home inspector saying, my spouse tested positive for COVID, I'm in the house for 14 days, you would include that there in number 2, all right? Or if you have been in the hospital or you are in the hospital, okay, you would include a copy of that admittance paperwork or whatever. Not only do you have to tell the other party the reason, but under number 2, you've got to show verification, okay? Again, you don't want to use COVID as an excuse not to perform if COVID is not the reason that the parties cannot perform, all right? Let me go up here and see if there's any questions. Doesn't look like we have any chats. We're all still good. All right. So, so that is the, whoops. Can everybody see my screen still? Hopefully.
Yes.
Good, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the excuse or the reason form that we give. If you're in a landlord situation, since we have the CVA for the purchase agreement, we also have a CVA for leases. We have an NUCC for purchase agreements, and we have an NUCC for lease agreements. If I was doing these forms, I would have put after the NUCC a dash RPA. So you know this is attached to the RPA and this is attached to the lease. When CAR first introduced these forms, they only came out with the CVA to use in all situations. They later came out with the CVA-LR to deal with leases. So they never did update the letters for NUCC. But NUCC is for purchase agreement. NUCC-LR is for lease agreement. Now let's talk about landlord tenant. Now, I think most of you probably are not engaged in property management, but for the few that you are, or maybe you have rental properties, first document here is the notice of tenant on ability to pay rent. So let's say you have a situation where The tenant approaches you and says, hey, I understand we don't have to pay rent anymore because of COVID. That is when you give your tenant or your client's tenant this form and say, if your inability to pay rent is related to COVID, then yes, you may be exempted from paying rent. You don't have the money to do it. But it has to be related to COVID. Going back to that elementary school teacher, says, I don't want to pay rent because of COVID. No, you're still getting paid, right? You're teaching online, but you're still getting paid. You have to pay rent. So this lets the tenant know that if their inability to pay rent is related to COVID, that's an excuse. But if it's not COVID related, then they still have to pay their rent, all right? Now, I've had some people say, you know, I'm not real wild about giving tenants this letter or this form because it's almost encouraging them not to pay rent. They're going to use COVID as an excuse. You don't have to give this to your tenants. It's optional, but it is written verification explaining to them that if your inability to pay rent is COVID related, that's an excuse. But if it's not COVID related, then no. Now, after you give them this form and they say, yes, it's COVID related, I can't pay my rent, you say, okay, let me now have you sign the coronavirus rent payment delay and repayment agreement. You see, this is simply a deferral of paying rent. It is not an abatement. You still have to pay your rent. And what this form will do is it will set out when you plan to pay your rent. In other words, what is being due now and when will it be repaid? And what is the proof that you don't or unable to pay your rent? So you need to show that it's COVID related. And you need to show that the amount of money that you're still receiving is sufficient to pay rent and their living expenses. And you create an addendum to their current rental agreement where you have the rent delayed, and then at the bottom, what the repayment plan is. Now, if you have taken this class from me a while back, you will notice that this is a new form. The old form, okay, began in April and ended in June. And here it is July. So anticipate this form being updated as we march through COVID, all right? It is fairly generic right now, but you'll notice under 6A1, they've got a date of 2020. It's quite possible in January, we will see that change to 2021. So as I said before at the beginning of this class, these forms are constantly updating. There are no new forms, at least not in the last month or so. But the current forms are going to be updating as we progress through this pandemic. So just keep that in mind. Don't use an old form. If you see a form that looks out of date, it probably is, time to do the updated agreement, okay? And then there is a second page, okay? Again, creating this rent repayment schedule, payment and repayment schedule, okay? So again, not gonna spend too much time unless you have questions on this, since I know most of you are probably not dealing with property management. Now we come to the best practices. Now, this form was, I think, 8 pages. It went down to 5 pages. There appears to be a version that's popping up with 2 pages, but I believe the form that you're going to be using is 5 pages. That 2-page form that's out there may be for giving to sellers, but I believe you can use a 5-page form. My recommendation is the 5-page form. The law requires that offices have a best practices policy. And that's what this is. So your managers, your brokers should have adopted this policy. This policy can now then be shared with buyers, sellers, and visitors. All right. So what we want to do in addition to that PEAD is we also want to give them a copy of our best practices. So all offices need to adopt the best practices. If you want to simply adopt this, if your office wants to adopt this, you're in compliance. And then it's always a good idea when you start a representation with a buyer or seller, you share with them your best practices, okay? Unlike the PEAD, you don't have to do it continually, okay? You don't have to do it every day. And my understanding is you only have to do it once. It is a multi-page form, okay? So it goes into showing properties for visitors, okay? For sellers, arranging showings, how to view the property, communications between parties, right? Provision for sanitizing. So, okay. Persons in the property, use hand sanitizer, hand sanitizing wipes. Real estate licensees will ensure that properties are equipped with sanitation products, okay? Provide their clients with face coverings and sanitizers, and then all people will wash their hands or use sanitizer immediately upon entry and then leaving the property. And then responsibility for cleaning, okay? Again, we refer to the cleaning disinfecting protocols for showing properties, the Department of Public Health guidance, right? Seller may want to hire somebody to come in, okay? But again, responsibility is for the seller to maintain and clean the property. So back to Sean's question, not real specific on what needs to be done other than using sanitizing wipes and disinfectants to cleaning areas that are going to be touched or possibly could be touched, all right? And then page 5, social distancing, okay? Any questions on the best practices at this point? Let's see, oh, here's a chat. Okay, can we use the form, print and share with our prospects, the public, copyright? As long as you're providing the forms to people you're interacting with, that is a part of your business, you are okay, all right? Should you become a distributor of information to for sale by owners so that they can then use their forms, not recommended, okay? Because you understand what the forms do. You have training, not just this class, but other classes and information from CAR. It is best not to be a purveyor of CAR forms to people you do not have a relationship with, okay? Let's see, going back. Why is it necessary to sanitize when buyers preview with gloves? Okay, so if your buyers are putting on gloves, they do not touch their face, eyes, nose, mouth. They keep the gloves going through the house and then leave there should be no reason to sanitize if they were wearing gloves and a mask, because they have essentially encapsulated themselves. All right. Earlier question, what happens when kids are in the property? Good luck with kids keeping gloves on, right? Good luck with kids keeping their mask on. So if you've got kids in the property, that's when the sanitizing comes in. If you touch your face and you're infectious and you touch objects, then those objects need to be sanitized. If your hands are clean and you don't touch your face and you touch objects, then theoretically they wouldn't have to be sanitized. If you put on a mask and gloves before entering the property, assuming those masks and gloves are clean, then anything you touch in that property will not become contaminated. So when you leave the property, now you need to carefully remove the gloves and masks, dispose of them, because if there was some contamination in the property, it's now on your gloves. And if you were to touch your eyes, your face, your mouth with your gloves, then you could become infectious. So again, the gloves act as a sanitizing barrier so that once we take them off, we will not infect ourselves, okay? Write a book with the information you are teaching. Oh, wouldn't that be nice if I had time to do that? Thank you. Let's see. Are association offices allowed to self-provide CAR COVID forms to the public? I'll let Stephanie follow up with this at the end, but standard CAR and association protocols are they do not provide CAR forms to non-members. Reason one, non-members do not belong to CAR, therefore they are not necessarily entitled to purchase them. But number two, it could go into the unlicensed practice of law. So I'm not a member of the, I believe it is the, oh yeah, let's use the Beverly Hills Association of Realtors, or it's not Beverly Hills, I think it's the Greater Los Angeles Association of Realtors. So they don't know who I am. If I were to go down there and try to buy a CAR purchase agreement, they would ask for, or ask to see my driver's license and my DRE license card. The reason for that is they will sell a form to a non-member as long as that person has a real estate license, but they will not sell that form to a layperson. And the reason being is we have now gone through several forms. I've explained the difference of the several forms. And again, the PEAD overlaps a bit with the BPPP and overlaps a bit with the PRE, but they have separate purposes. Lay people, unlicensed people, probably do not understand the reasons for those separate forms. You do. And that is why typically associations will not sell CAR forms to the general public, all right? We do showings within 15 minutes between to sanitize, but we wear gloves, masks, and shoe coverings. It seems like overkill to wipe down in between. I understand kids are a different issue. Sean, you're right, okay? If everybody behaved themselves and everybody followed the rules, these guidelines wouldn't be as strict. But they are set out to overlap and try to fill in the gaps. I mean, even though in most counties we have a mandatory face mask order, right? We hear reports every day of people refusing to wear masks and then going ballistic if somebody politely asks them to wear a mask because it's claimed to be an infringement of their liberties, right? So we have what many would call very strict guidelines, but if we adhere to them, hopefully everybody stays healthy. Let's see. Oh, for me to write a booklet, I mean. Again, just be sure if you're writing something, if it's for your use, okay, that's great. But be very careful on writing things for other people, because if you don't get it all right, then you could take liability for that. So you want to be very careful on that. All right, so BPP. Our next form, or next document, I should say, is the May 2020 summary. I've included this here so that you can kind of get an idea. Of course, this is from May, and some of these forms have been updated. To the best of my knowledge, CAR has not done a new update. I have to check it. One of the problems, I have a lot of problems with CAR, but one of the problems why I have CAR is when you go on their website, you can never find anything. This will be in the legal tab of the site. So you gotta have to search a little bit for it. Or you can call the CAR legal hotline and they can provide it for you. But I've included this here. I believe that Stephanie has emailed you out both the copy of the PowerPoint and the handout. If you would like any of these sent to you, or if you have a simple question, as long as it relates to education, because that's what I do. I teach, right? I'm teaching real estate principles and real estate practice online right now. That's what I do. I'm happy to educate, but I cannot give you legal advice. So if anything in this does not make sense to you, or there's a lingering question, or maybe I didn't cover it quite as well as I should have. Again, I was hoping to wrap this thing up in about an hour. I see we're now in about an hour 15, but I will stay on if we want to open it up for the chat room, or if we want to unmic and talk, depending on how many people we had. I think Stephanie said we had about 75 people come in, but I'm happy to discuss educational issues with you. I just have my disclaimer down that, again, I'm not here to give legal or tax advice. So as long as it's of an educational nature, happy to discuss things with you. That's what I'm here for. Let's see. I don't think we have any questions in the chat room, Stephanie. Do you have any questions, or I'll throw it up to anybody else? Any questions regarding the material I presented?
Professor Estes?
Yes, Sean.
Hey, I just want to thank you for answering my questions. There's been a lot of concerns and questions lately, especially from buyers and buyers agents, as to what we're doing in between showings in order to protect their clients. We've gone as far, I mean, we're one step away from putting them in a hazmat suit, but we do everything that we can to keep the houses clean, and most of that is done. You know, the homeowners clean it first, and then we upkeep it while we're showing. You know, we'll do 6 or 7 showings at a time, but we're the ones that have to clean in between, because I send the owners out because I don't want them at the house when we're showing. Yeah, is that a concern? Does that raise a concern with you?
Not really. If you're gloving them up, that's a huge effort. I mean, if you're gloving them, of course, if they stick their finger in their mouth and then touch something with their gloves on, then we have a problem. If they glove up, if they have a mask on, I don't think most people would rub their eyes with their gloves on, although I've seen people in the grocery store do it. If they mask up, they glove up, go through the property, and then they dispose of those items properly and bring the next one through. I think what I would do is, if you have sanitizing wipes, just kind of wipe up behind them, wipe behind them, kind of watch where they're touching. I think you're good enough, okay? I think you're good enough. You know, it's how far we go. I mean, I don't think they're expecting you to go to an ICU level of sanitizing. But Sean, it sounds like you're doing what you need to do, okay? The big thing and the big questions I get a lot are open houses. They're problematic. So we're not quite there yet, but I think you're on board. You're doing what you need to do, Sean. Do we have any
Okay,
other
thank you very
questions?
much. And by the way, is it Professor Estes or Edwin, or what do we call you?
Well, my students call me all kinds of things. Ed works really well. The only time I insist on professor is if you're in my classroom. So if you haven't taken legal aspects and you want to get your broker's license and you sign up for legal aspects in a face-to-face class, I may ask you to call me professor so I don't lose control of my rest of my students. I've got a few 17-year-olds, but other than that, please call me Ed.
Okay, thank you. And I'll probably see you next semester.
Okay, great.
Goodbye.
Any other questions out there that you just want to fire through?
Yes, Professor Esther, we are in a class right now,
Okay.
if I may. Thank you so much. This is such a great information. I've been waiting for something like that and give us a lot more confidence on our next step forward.
Okay. Are you in one of my classes at Mount SAC right now?
Oh, no, I meant the class right now.
Okay.
It's a Zoom class I'm referring to.
I was speaking more to my Mount SAC students. With community colleges, sometimes we have to keep a little bit of a barrier, but
Sure.
my policy is as soon as you get your license, we're equals, right? We all have real estate licenses, and I just happen to be the one giving the information. A few months from now, I may be attending a webinar by one of you, and you'll be teaching me something I don't know.
Well, the question I have is, we see that this thing has changed so much, and we realtors are so busy. Most of the time, we just don't get to keep up with our education. I wouldn't even expect 10% of the people would even go through things you teach today. And there's a lot of risk involved because we're involved with different people, different homes, different showing, different, buyer, seller, and agent and stuff. How can we do a better job to help disseminate this information out? The question asked you about writing a booklet to kind of pass along. And if we put a disclaimer like what you had at the bottom of your contact information, would that be helpful? And just, to our fellow agent and maybe to some other people who are looking to future prospect, that kind of thing?
Well, Stephanie has a copy of what I have here.
Okay.
Whenever I do a webinar, and again, we'll probably be doing a purchase agreement webinar, listing agreement, buyer representation. I always provide a copy of my webinar and my handout to Stephanie. You're always welcome to email me. I'm willing to share my teaching materials. If you have a specific question, I always recommend you go to your manager or your broker first, because depending on how you ask the question, I may be giving an answer different than what your broker or your manager gives. My first rule is your manager or your broker is always correct, unless they're wrong. But I want to make sure you're asking the same question. So what I always recommend is if you're going to email me, and again, it's an education question. When do I give the PEAD? When do I give that PRE? For example, that PRE document, let me go back to it, the little pictographs, okay? If I can get back to it. Where is it? There it is. I know some listing agents actually have these two documents laminated and they permanently put them on the front door. Or they put them above the place where the lockbox is, so it's not necessarily visible from the street. That's great, okay? If you have a question on the posting of the PEAD or something this or something that, if it's purely educational, my recommendation is if you want to email me, copy your broker or manager so I can reply to all, as long as it's an educational question, I'm happy to answer them, okay? Now, if it goes into the area of legal advice, I recommend you call the CAR legal hotline. And their attorneys are very good, okay? I've not found them wrong on anything that I've asked them, because sometimes I get into a situation where people are saying different things and I want to just verify that the two of us are in agreement. Now, I call them all the time, so there's nothing wrong with calling them. It's free. Give me your cell phone number because sometimes it can take 24 hours for them to get back to you, but they are good at getting back to you. So again, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, as long as it's educational, I'm good. I just want to give you the caveat, I'm not going to be giving legal advice. All right? Other questions? Well, Stephanie, it sounds like we've exhausted everything. Do you want to go ahead and make your final comments? I think Stephanie's out there. Maybe Stephanie's muted.
Uh-oh, cricket, cricket.
All
We
right,
could do the Jeopardy thing.
another chat is coming in. Oh, just a thank you. Thank you very much. You're very welcome. I guess I'll go ahead and sign off. I don't have control, but again, just as a reminder, my contact information is in the back here. Although my phone number is on the PowerPoint, whoops, there's nobody at school right now because we're all online, but I do check my email regularly. If for no other reason, I'm teaching 2 online classes, and we will be offering all of our real estate classes this fall, but we will be on an online format for fall and for winter. So FYI, if you or anybody you know is thinking about taking real estate classes, I think you'll learn more here than you will from a home study course. All right? Stephanie, are you back yet? Still no Stephanie?
Cricket, cricket.
I guess so. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, more chats coming in. Thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Zoom meeting.